Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much for coming back to All Things Avennia. My name is Eli Travers, and today I'm super excited. We're going to be talking about sparkling wine. Most of what we'll talk about, I'll give you the caveat, is champagne, but we're going to cover sort of the basis of how sparkling wine is made in different methods and where you can find it in places all over the world. And then we will have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. But I'm going to get right to it. There's a lot to cover. I'm super excited. If you know me, you know there's going to be some really geeky history things and probably some sciencey stuff, but that's what we're all here for. So I am going to share my screen now, and we'll get started. So, sparkling wine of the world. So to get started, I wanted to go through a very brief history, and this is mainly going to be history of French sparkling wine, because again, we'll be talking mostly about champagne. But in essence, sparkling wine was one of the other happy accidents in the wine world. When we talked about oak barrels or barrel aging and barrel fermentation, that was another thing that tended to be, they didn't realize at the time the benefits of it and how great of a thing that was going to be for the wine industry. And it just sort of happened on accident. They put wine in barrels. Same thing happened here. They discovered that sometimes cold winters in certain areas that produced wine would stop fermentation, and what that would do is leave some of the yeast and some of the sugars that hadn't been fermented yet in the bottle, in the wine. They would bottle that and put it in the cellar, and then when spring arrived the next season and things started to warm up, that yeast would wake up. It would start converting all that sugar again into alcohol, but also carbon dioxide. And at this point, since it had nowhere to go, it would increase pressure in the bottle until those bottles would explode. And it was actually a pretty scary thing. People would go down to the cellars to find bottles exploding, and it was kind of a chain reaction. It would make other bottles explode. And for a long time, they didn't know why. It was considered a fault. But it wasn't until 1531, and this is in southern France, in Limoux, part of the Languedoc region, that they actually intentionally started making wine so that it would do that, so that it would be sparkling. And we'll talk about how they did that a little bit later. It wasn't until 1662 that they started realizing how sugar affected the wine. So there was an English scientist who was the first one to actually document that if you added sugar to wine, that it would produce sparkling wine. They were doing the same thing with cider in the day, so they used the same logic as far as wine goes. And then in the 17th century, this is also when the British were developing stronger glass bottles. If you remember a few weeks back when we talked about wine bottles, they were using coal-fired ovens as opposed to charcoal made from oak or from wood. And that stronger, hotter fire was able to yield stronger bottles. And then they were the English were the ones who were able to bottle that champagne into those stronger bottles, and they would actually last and not explode. And then 1801, by the time we get into the 19th century, it really starts taking off. A chemist by the name of Jean-Antoine Chaptal further explains that sugar and fermentation link in that relationship. He's also the one that chaptalization is named after, which we talked about before too, the process of adding sugar before fermentation to boost your alcohol levels in the finished wine. And then the beginning of that 19th century is also when there was advances in cork and enclosure technology. There was definitely a higher demand. So at the same time that Chaptal was publishing the effects of sugar and alcohol, a pharmacist by the name of Andrew Francois found the precise measurement of sugar to put into the bottle to jumpstart that fermentation to make bubbles, but very particularly without exploding the bottle. So this was a big discovery that producers finally knew exactly how much sugar to put in to keep the wine from losing it, from exploding. This is around the same time that Veuve Clicquot, the widow Clicquot, develops the process of riddling, which we will definitely talk about in a little bit. And then in 1844, the wire cage called a muselet was invented by Adolphe Jackson. And the muselet is taken from the French word for muzzle. It was actually used to muzzle the cork. I have it right here because I am drinking champagne. And this is what secured the cork around the lip of the bottle, which again made it easier to produce wine. You wouldn't lose as much wine because before that, the corks would just fly out. Because even though the glass bottles were stronger, they still didn't have a way to secure the cork until 1844. And this is also the century that champagne really started turning into a luxury product. It was in high demand by British royalty, famously the Russian czars, kings from Belgium and Greece, and it really set it up to be a boom for that industry. The first brut champagne, so at the time, most champagne was on the sweeter side of things. It's how a lot of, especially the Russians, really enjoyed sweeter drinks and sweet champagne. But the British were the ones that started asking for drier styles, and so in 1874, this is the first time we see a brut style champagne, which has less sugar in it. And 1908, so this is going back to phylloxera, the root louse that took over Europe and decimated vineyards. That hit Champagne in about the 1890s. And so fraud and all these things followed. And so Champagne region, the government actually officially defined that area for the first time. But there were riots and protests that followed because they cut out some of the southern regions, the Côte d'Ivoire, and they came up. It was actually a pretty violent thing. They had to bring in the French army to keep things okay. But there was still a lot of destruction. And so throughout the next couple of decades, and again, this is during World War I, lots of things going on. But eventually that law would change back in 1927 to include that greater area. And then the official appellation was created in 1936, along with Châteauneuf-du-Pape and a lot of those other first appellations in those first couple of years. In other places, so now away from France for just a minute, in 1754 was the first written record of Bubbly Prosecco. So this is sparkling wine made in the Veneto region in northern Italy. And at the time it was vinified and it was called col fondo, which just meant with sediment. And this is what helped, having that sediment, which again was lees, and some sugars that hadn't fermented fully yet. When they bottled that again would create those bubbles in the bottle. Down in Spain, so about 100 years later in 1872, this is the first sparkling wine made in the Penedès region by Josep Fatjo. And this was, he had been in France and had learned how they were doing it there, brought it down to the Catalonia region. And it was so successful, he made some really great wines that he ordered a cave to be dug, or a cava. And that's what gives us the name to Cava, a very well-known Spanish sparkling wine now. And then a few decades later is where we get the tank method, which is a much faster process of making bubbles in wine that's primarily used in Italy, but other places as well. But Federico Martinotti was the first one to invent it and patent that style. And it was later refined by Eugene Charmat, who actually ends up getting the credit a lot of times, and it's known as the Charmat method. But this makes Prosecco a lot cheaper to produce, and it booms because a lot more people can actually drink Prosecco and rather than champagne, which was such a luxury item. But now to the process. This is what I think is pretty interesting and very complex and just a fascinating subject. But when we think about getting bubbles in wine, there's actually 4 main ways of doing it, or 4.5, because there's this weird extension. But the 4 main methods are the traditional method, which is what you'd think of when you think of champagne. There's tank method, or that Charmat method, which is what most Prosecco is made into. There's sort of an offshoot of that called the continuous method, which we'll talk about later. The natural method, and this is going back to those original sparkling wines in Limoux in the south of France. That's a very old method of doing sparkling wine, sort of the original method. And then carbonation, which we actually won't talk about later, but just want to let you know that there is definitely wine that uses carbonation. A lot of cheap bubbly you'll see on the shelves in grocery stores, and some Vinho Verde from Portugal, which can be delicious. Sometimes are just injected with carbonation as opposed to a secondary fermentation. But first, traditional method sparkling wine. So this is also called champagne method, or méthode champenoise, because that's where they really nailed it down and developed it over many, many years to the point where it's at today. And we'll go over the major steps. So all the way from pressing those original grapes, that first fermentation to make your base wine, the art of assemblage or blending, which is very important in champagne, that secondary fermentation to create bubbles in the bottle, and then the process of getting that yeast out of the bottle called riddling, disgorgement, and then the final dosage, or how you make the wine sweet in the end, or determine what style you're going to have, and then aging. So first, 3 presses. So in Champagne, this is a really northerly region, and again, when we talk about primary, or when we talk about traditional method, it's basically going to be about Champagne. But you can sort of copy most of these things in other areas that do traditional method, but the Champagne region is probably the most finicky and has the most restrictions on how to do this. But in Champagne, you're only allowed to press a certain amount of wine from the grapes that you harvest. And it's actually in law that you can only press 2,550 liters per 5 kilograms harvested. And they split it into 3 different presses, or 3 different groupings. The first roughly 2,000 liters is the vin de cuvée. This is what will become the highest quality wine. And a lot of that is because this is your free run juice. When you put all your grapes in the press, a lot of times the weight of the grapes themselves will start crushing grapes, and juice will run free. And you don't even have to press down on it yet, which can extract some harsher tannins and pigment. That's what comes in with that next one, the vin de thé. They separate the vin de cuvée first. They might have a little pressing just to get that amount of must. But the second part is often sold off. There's higher in pigment, a little higher tannin or phenolics, and they'll sell that off to negociants or other houses that are making wines. And then anything left is called the rebèche, and this is actually required by law to be distilled or discarded, but to not be turned into champagne, turned into bubbly wine, just because it's the harshest of that pressing, of that must. And after you press it, you allow the bourgs, the solids, to settle, which is a process called débourbage. This is often when you also chaptalize, so especially in very cold vintages where you might not have a lot of sugar to begin with because these grapes don't get ripe enough, they'll add a little sugar to help boost fermentation when they make their base wine. And this base wine, as it says, is vin clair. It's a very low pH, so super acidic wine, and also low alcohol. This is like the way we make wine here, but our wines will range from 13 to 15% alcohol. This is 11% alcohol is what will end up happening. But there's a reason for that. Not only that's how the grapes come in, but you sort of want lower alcohol before you go into your second fermentation, because you will boost up the alcohol again. And often the vin clair, this base wine, is made in stainless steel or just neutral barrel. Very rarely they'll actually use new oak. Some of maybe the more famous houses will experiment with doing certain oak age or new oak aged wines. Sometimes they will go through malolactic fermentation. It's more common in Champagne than it is in other parts of the world that make sparkling, like Spain, because they want to keep their acidities. In Champagne, the wines are so acidic that the malolactic fermentation helps soften the wines a little bit if you're too worried about acidity, if it's too high. And then they're usually clarified, so fined or filtered, or even using a centrifuge before the next step, which is blending. So assemblage is the fancy French term for this, but it's just a very super important process in Champagne. And the reason is because it's such a far north location. Vintage variation is a big deal, that you'll have a lot of vintages where it's hard to get grapes ripe enough, and whether that's because of spring frost that can destroy crop early on in the cycle, or hail events or rain during harvest, that there's a lot of inconsistency from year to year. So what they can do is they blend from many different vineyards. This is why some of the biggest houses will source from all over the region, and so they have more options to blend with. They'll blend with different types of grapes. They'll even blend with different years or different vintages. So this is one of the nice things about Champagne, is they do allow you to blend from previous years, or many previous years. Up to 20 different vintages can go into the wine. I don't think there's an actual limit, but 20 is sort of the most that I've seen, or that people have said has happened. Most of the time it's between 3 and 5 different vintages blended together to make this wine. And it's the other reason to do that is because it's determines the house's style or the domain's styles. When you think of Krug or you think of Bollinger or Tétanger and all these different champagnes, a lot of their style, their house style, comes in their consistency of their non-vintage, of this blend that they make every year. And so keeping your older reserve wines helps make sure you have more of the same sort of style and same flavors year to year. You do see vintage champagne, so you are allowed by law to make up to 80% of each vintage can be labeled as a vintage champagne. You can often garner a lot higher prices with vintage champagne, but it's saved for the best vintages. And usually it's only declared every, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or longer, just because of vintage variation. And yeah, it's blending is amazing. I see if you see all these lots, a lot of producers, I think these are Krug's lots. They famously will separate every single block of grapes they bring in, vinify it all separately, and go through and have to taste everything. And I can't imagine the dental insurance bills for those people that have to constantly just swish super acidic wine in their mouths and taste and blend these every year. It's pretty incredible. So then we get to the magic. This is the prise de mousse, or the secondary fermentation. This is where we get bubbles. It literally means making foam or formation of bubbles. So after blending, which is usually around February or March, the year after harvest, the wine is cold stabilized and then racked for bottling. But when it's bottled, there's an addition of a thing called liqueur de tirage. And this is a mix of wine, yeast, sugar, and then some fining agents. And this little concoction is what will jumpstart the secondary fermentation. The bottles at this time are sealed with a crown cap instead of a cork. And that crown cap actually has a little plastic cylinder on the underside of it called a bidule. And that will help trap the lees in the next process. When the tirage happens, they're laid on their side, or sur latte. And this process, this secondary fermentation, lasts about 8 weeks. Obviously, it can depend on temperature, depend on where you are and the wines themselves, but roughly 8 weeks. And during this time, the alcohol level will rise another percentage, between 1.2 and 1.3%. This is where the pressure inside that bottle will increase because of that trapped carbon dioxide. And this gets all the way to 5 to 6 atmospheres of pressure. And then in this process, it's aged by law in Champagne at least, it has to be aged for at least 12 months before dégorgement, or before it's disgorged. But you have a bottle that's filled with lees, with this spent lees after fermentation, but we need to get it into the neck in order to get that out. So this is where the beautiful riddling or remouage comes into play. So before Veuve Clicquot invented how to riddle, which you can sort of see in those pictures is how they used to do it. Originally, they used a method called transvasage or dépotage, which they literally would just sort of decant a bottle that had all the spent lees from secondary fermentation, and pour it into a clean bottle to separate them. But you lost a lot of wine that way. You lost a lot of the bubbles, a lot of that pressure. And so Madame Barbe Nicole Ponsardin, who married Mr. Clicquot, I forget his first name, Philippe, I believe, Francois, one of those. Her husband died young, and she took over the business. It was actually a pretty amazing thing. If you haven't read the book, The Widow Clicquot, it's a really fascinating story about this woman in an age where women were not entrusted with businesses. But she made this house, the Clicquot Champagne House, famous. And one of the reasons was she developed this process of riddling. And you can see on the right side of your screen that plank, that they basically made a pupitre, which is an A-frame made of planks with holes drilled in it, so that when you start, the wine bottle that's near the bottom of the screen is sur latte, it's on its side. And slowly, over a process of about 8 weeks, and this is before disgorgement, so you know, if you've been aging it for 12 months, this is the very end of the process before you're gonna finish the process. You got to move all those lees, all these spent lees inside into the neck. So what they used to do is this man on the left, or a remueur, would go through and by hand tilt and turn every single bottle in the cellar in
in order to eventually tilt the bottle until it was upside down, until it was sur point, which is the name, or sur pointe, which is the name, as it's upside down and the lees are stuck in the bottom of the cap. And this process took a while, and it was obviously labor intensive. You had very skilled people that could do it, even up to tens of thousands of bottles a day. I think someone said 70,000 bottles someone could riddle in one day. Just insane. But it also, this is a part of the process that made it very expensive, and it took a long time. So nowadays we have something called the gyropalette, or girasol in Spanish, because it was invented by these two Frenchmen, but it was actually premiered in Penedès region in Spain for Cava. But this, as you can see, is this big cube. It's an automatic device that can riddle 504 bottles at one time. It's a lot faster process. It actually usually only takes about 1 week to get all the lees into the bottom of the cap, as opposed to 8 weeks. And the other thing that's important and why they want the lees to move that way instead of just shake the bottle, which they used to do to get all the lees in the bottom, is there's a benefit of having the lees touch all the wine. And so when you slowly turn the bottle over time, the lees will start coating more of the wine. And there's a process called autolysis, which happens. And it's an enzymatic process where proteins and carbohydrates are released into the wine, but it ends up it changes the flavor and texture of the wine and gives you that famous breadiness or brioche biscuit aromas that you'll find in champagne. So that's really one of the important things, is having those spent yeast cells, those lees, touch the wine over that time helps develop that flavor that we know and love about champagne. But you still get that in that faster process, that weak process. And then we get to another fun part of the process called dégorgement. And now most of the time they'll do a process called dégorgement à la glace. Glass for ice, because once the bottle is upside down, it'll be placed into a freezing brine solution just up to that deck where all the solids have settled. And it'll turn that into an ice cube, so that when you do turn it over, and this bottling line, I think this is Paul Roger bottling line, shows that when it comes back around, you can pop the crown cap open, the ice cube comes shooting out, and a little wine shoots out as well. But no worry, because the next thing we do is called liqueur d'expédition, which is where you replace the wine you lost with a mix of more wine and a sugar syrup. And this is where you get your dosage level, or your sweetness level, in the final wine. And there's many different styles or levels of sweetness in the champagne. So the most common, at least now that you'll see, is Brut style. Again, that's that style that they created more for the British, as those British tastes wanted drier styles. But anywhere from Brut Nature or Brut Zero to Extra Brut, all the way to Extra Dry, Sek, Demi-Sek, and Doux. And you can see it ranges from almost no additional sugar when you add the dosage back in, to over 50 grams to make it more of a dessert style wine. And it's interesting, sort of side note, if you look at Sek, Demi-Sek, and Doux, that's French for dry, half dry, and sweet. But Sek is still, if you were to taste a Sek wine, it still tastes pretty sweet to us. And that's because champagne used to be very sweet, even the wines that had 30 grams per liter of sugar in them were drier compared to the other wines. And so they created Extra Dry, there's a reason it's in English, the word's Extra Dry, because they would make it for the English market. And it was to denote that this is something that's drier than what you might be used to, but we know you'll love it. And then Brut is even brutish, it's more dry than that. And then Extra Brut is even drier than that. And I think of it almost, if you're familiar with Starbucks coffee sizes, it's kind of the same process. In Starbucks, you have your tall, and it's a small, and I never understood why a small coffee was called a tall, but it's because originally there was only two sizes, a short and a tall, an 8 ounce and 12 ounce. And so they had to add Grande and Venti, and now Trenta, I think, as the sizes got bigger and bigger, but they still kept the name tall. So it's kind of a similar thing. I don't know if that works for anyone else, but it works for me. It's how I understand it. And then as far as the main styles of champagne, like I said, that non-vintage, or NV, if you ever see that on the label, is your blend of multiple vintages. We talked about vintage wines, which can be declared in great vintages. Most often they're Brut style, and they can age for a very long time. And then you have your Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir.
wines. Blanc basically means white from whites, and so it's a white wine or a white champagne wine made from white grapes only. And these are some of the best champagne in the world are this style, this Blanc de Blanc style. And then Blanc de Noir is on the other side is made from red grapes only. So this is white wine made from red grapes because they press it immediately so they don't get any of the skins to give it color. The Prestige Cuvée is the top bottling from each house. So if you're familiar with Dom Perignon, that's Moet Chandon's Prestige Cuvée, or Le Grand Dame is the Veuve Clicquot Prestige Cuvée. Each one has their own special name. And then lastly, Rosé Champagne can be made in any of the styles. It can be a prestige, it can be just a non-vintage. But what makes it kind of unique is it is the only appellation in France where they allow blending to make rosé, where they actually can take mostly white wine and a little red wine, blend it together. They don't have to use saignée or press or other methods to make that rosé color. And then I just thought it was interesting to think about, why is champagne so celebratory? How did it get to the point where we think of champagne or bubbles and sparkling wine in general as a celebratory thing? And these are just some fun historical tidbits about why that is. So we're going way back to 496 when Clovis, which was the first king of France, was converted to Catholicism, and apparently it was a bet with his wife. Had a battle coming up, and his wife was Catholic, and he said, "Well, if I win the next battle, I'll convert to Catholicism." And he won the battle, and so he had promised his wife he'd do that, and they were in northern France, in Reims, and that's where he ended up converting to Catholicism. And because of that cathedral and that place became this very historical, very reverent and sacred place for the French. And so a few hundred years later, when Charlemagne's son Louis was crowned, he was also crowned in Reims, and that became a tradition where royalty was crowned in Champagne, in that region. And so when you think about that, all the nobility and royalty and everyone that would come for the coronation, they'd want to drink wine and celebrate. So what were they drinking? They were drinking champagne. And already that it was, marketing before marketing. Already that was being instilled in people's minds as something worth celebrating. And then you also, around this time, had royal physicians who would prescribe wine. And I didn't know this too, and I just found it hilarious, that they would prescribe wine from somewhere as having health benefits, and every year they would recommend a wine. And it would cure gout, and it would cure malaria and morning sickness, all these issues, all these health issues, and they'd think, oh well, this wine from this region would fix all of your ailments. And champagne was just the most often picked wine, so a lot of people wanted champagne because they thought it would make them healthier. And the biggest rivalry for champagne for the region was Burgundy, and they didn't like that. So they decided to focus on red wine, because at that time champagne was mostly white wine. They made red wine, but they couldn't make red wine as good as Burgundy, because Burgundy was a little further south. It was easier to get riper grapes. So that's when Champagne, and with the help of Dom Perignon, figured out how to make white wine from red grapes. That's the Blanc de Noir history there. To focus on white, because they thought that was how they were going to be special, and how Champagne could stay relevant. Champagne, the region was also on a trade and military route. So no matter, every time an army or a minister or officials would be going through Champagne from Paris and elsewhere in Europe, they'd pass through Champagne and drink. And Napoleon, although some people think it was Winston Churchill, no one really knows who said it, but Napoleon gets the credit most often of saying, "Champagne, in victory one deserves it, in defeat one needs it." And I think that's so true. So where else is this style of wine made in the world? A lot of places. Obviously, Champagne has the clout of being one of the original places for very, very fine sparkling wine. But there's delicious wines made everywhere else. Even in France, there's a lot of great wine made in that method called Crémant. In Crémant de Loire, in Alsace, in Burgundy, Bordeaux, many other places. Blanquette de Limoux. So back in the ancestral home of sparkling wine in France, they also make a sparkling wine called Blanquette de Limoux through traditional method. A lot of Sekt, so sparkling wine in Austria and Germany, is made in this way, especially the highest quality wines. Franciacorta is probably the champagne of Italy, in northern Italy, in Lombardy.
and Oltreppo Pavese Metodo Classico, some delicious wines there as well. And then Cava, we talked about in Spain. England, which is interesting because they share actually the same soil type, very similar soils to Champagne, these really chalky limestone soils. And so now that with climate change and with temperatures raising, it's getting easier to grow grapes in England. So they're actually starting to make some really delicious sparkling wines that are pretty similar to Champagne in quality in the UK. In the US, we obviously have sparkling wine everywhere because we can make whatever we want, wherever we want to make it. There is California Champagne that got grandfathered in before the EU outlawed the term champagne on bottles to protect the original champagne. But they're making sparkling wine in South Africa called Classique. And then, of course, you have your famous sparkling Shiraz and sparkling red wines in Australia, as well as some amazing champagne-like wines from Tasmania, actually, from Hobart and some of the regions in Tasmania. A lot of current champagne houses are starting to invest there and see the potential. But on to the next method. So away from France for a minute, and we'll talk more about tank method. This is what's called the Charmat method, the Metodo Martinotti, if you're in Italy and you don't want to name anything by a French person. But it's named after Eugene Charmat, who in 1907 refined the process that Martinotti started in making and designing these autoclaves, these tanks. And so the main difference here, we can think back to the whole process with Champagne. The main difference is that instead of that secondary fermentation happening in a bottle, it's happening in a tank, in these pressurized enamel-lined tanks. And the process only happens from a few days to about 6 weeks, so a lot less time than the 8 weeks it might take to create bubbles in the Champagne method. It usually reaches a little less pressure, a little less atmospheres of pressure than Champagne, and then it's chilled in order to stop fermentation, and then aged additionally. But then instead of the whole disgorging, you don't have to worry about that whole process of getting the yeast out. They just filter it and then bottle it, and so there's a lot more consistency with these larger vats of wine. And then again, you add dosage or that extra sweetness at the end to decide how sweet it's going to be. And the main difference, and this is, again, Prosecco. This is where most Prosecco is made in this style. The bubbles or the bead are a little larger and coarser than Champagne and a little less uniform. But the good thing about this method, especially for Prosecco, is that it's good for preserving the original varietal aromatics. So the grape in Prosecco, which used to be called Prosecco, it's now called Glera, is a beautiful aromatic grape that smells like flowers and peaches and pear and white grapey sort of notes, and it's beautiful. And if you were to put it in a traditional method, a Champagne method system to get those autolyzed flavors, it would totally mess up the beauty of that grape and those aromas. And so it really works here because you're able to keep those original aromatics all through the process. And this is a picture of some of those pressurized tanks that they use. So again, this is Prosecco. There's certain Asti Spumante that's made in this way. They also make some in the classical method. Moscato d'Asti and Bracchetto d'Acqui are both dessert wines that are made with this style. And then Lambrusco, a beautiful wine that can range in sweetness from dry to sweet from Emilia-Romagna and other areas towards central Italy. The majority of Sekt, so going back to Germany, is made in this method, or sort of a twist. This is that continuous method, or it's actually Russian continuous method. It was developed in the USSR, and it's basically a similar process, although they just used more tanks that are all connected, and they're constantly pumping the wine through these tanks and constantly adding more of that tirage, the liquor de tirage. And so it ends up having a little higher level or a little more of the biscuity aromas, the brioche aromas and flavors because of a little more of that development through the process. But it's still a fast process. It's a way to make wine a little cheaper for the market. And then lastly, we have the natural method, or méthode ancestrale, méthode rurale. This is your pétillant naturel. If you've ever seen the term pet nat, this is what it's referring to. This is the original method. This is the oldest method of making wine. So way back when I first started talking about this, and you had, the temperature would go down. You'd wait until the spring, the temperature would go back up, and the bottles would explode. Luckily, bottles aren't exploding anymore.
but it's a similar process. The initial fermentation happens in tank. You Before the process is complete, you bottle it, and the yeast will continue to ferment, and there's still sugar there that'll continue to be eaten, and then that's how you get your bubbles. And then the level of RS, or residual sugar, will vary by region, but you're not allowed to dose. You're not allowed after that to add more sugar. It can only be from the very original must, from the original grape juice you have. And some famous versions are Bugey-Cerdon, which is a beautiful, beautiful wine from close to Jura and Savoie in eastern France. That's sort of a light pinkish red flavor made from Gamay and Pulsard. That's a little sweet. You have Gaillac Mousseux, Méthode Gaillassoise, and some other Méthode Ancestral appellations in France. And then in the US, pet nats are everywhere. I feel like I see new pet nats all the time. It's as well as the natural wine movement, it's becoming trendy to make some pet nats. We have some really great ones in Washington and Oregon and a lot, and then for sure in California. Lastly, just a quick note on glassware. You can drink sparkling wine in any glass you want. There's obviously the flutes. This first one of the four over here is probably the most famous. It's what people think of with champagne. There's reasons for it. It is what allows you to look at the bubbles, the strain of bubbles for the longest, and it looks really elegant and celebratory. But it's not as great for actually smelling the wine. A lot of times you can't get as much of the aroma from the wine because the opening is too small. So you have a range of other options. The coupe over here on the left with the black background is probably the most extreme, the other end of it. And it's a really nice way to have champagne, but the bubbles will dissipate a lot faster. Same with sort of your burgundy glass over here. I prefer this tulip, right? And the second one over here, because you have the height of the flute and you can see a lot of the bubbles, but because of that the widening at the top, you can smell it a lot better and get more of the wine. At the end of the day, though, any clean glass you have, I just have an all-purpose wine glass here that's working fantastic. So that is, that's that. That is the end of our little presentation here. And I don't know about you, but that was a lot of. I'm a little dizzy from talking about fermentation, but this is the time for you guys to either ask me questions. If anything popped up, there might have been, whether it's about a wine I mentioned but didn't really get a chance to describe, or any part of the winemaking process, or if you just want to tell me what you're drinking. I'm drinking a Champagne Lombard, so it's a Premier Cru, extra brut style. So this is drier than bruts, from Epernay in Champagne. And yeah, at this time, if any of you have a question, please let me know. Yeah, Renee.
So you had mentioned vintage sparkling wine,
Yeah.
and I think one of your slides said that it could be decades old. Compared to like really old wines that you talked about last week with the wine fraud and everything, is there like an end date for sparkling wine being drinkable because of carbonation versus like regular wine?
Well, there's an end date, not necessarily because of carbonation. At a certain point, you will lose carbonation, like it won't stay forever, but the wine can still be delicious. And that's, there are some really old vintage champagne, and I've never tasted them, but I've seen people taste them, and they don't have as many bubbles. But it's still an incredible wine because it's developed in so many different ways, and you have those tertiary aromas and dried fruit flavors and all of that jazz. But wines can last a long time. And one of the things that a lot of producers, and especially in Champagne, are starting to do is tell you what date they disgorge on. So the disgorgement part, that part where you freeze the neck and then disgorge the thing. The reason you want to know when that's disgorged is because the wine will age differently. It ages differently before that, and it ages differently after that. So when you have the lees in the bottle, the lees will actually protect the wine from oxygen. So it slows the aging process. Even though it's adding those autolyzed flavors, the breadiness, the biscuitiness, and some nuttiness, and some really cool flavors from that, it's still not going to age it as long, or age it as fast, because there's less oxygen. But then as soon as you disgorge, a little oxygen gets in, You cork it, oxygen will slowly seep through that cork, even though it's pressurized, even though it has the cage on it. That's when oxidation will start, that slow process. And so you can have a wine. I was just reading. There's Bollinger makes a wine called Bollinger RD, and I think it's uh, delayed or recently disgorged, and they'll tell you they tasted a 1996 vintage, two bottles. One of them was disgorged in 2012. One was disgorged in 2017, and they were completely different because the one that was disgorged in 2017 had so much more time protected from oxygen that'll last even longer now that it's in bottle on its own. So that there's different things like that that can affect how long a sparkling wine can age at the end of the day. But it's also up to what you want to taste, what your preference is in aged wines.
Can I ask one little quick question?
Yeah,
Does it become more sweet or less sweet as it gets older, or does it matter? Or does it?
Sweetness doesn't change that much. I guess I would say that the perception of the sweetness probably changes because your acids eventually will die down, and so it might taste sweeter. But that's that's a good question. I'll have to do a little research on that because I'm not sure how sugar changes over time.
Thanks, Eli.
Yeah. Well, Robin said, can you talk a little more about American wine called Champagne? Yeah, I mean, and again, I'd have to do a little more research. But so the EU, I forget what year it was, but America, winemakers in the US have been making sparkling wine since the late 1800s. So in California, when wine was being produced, they figured out, oh, well, if they're doing it in France, we can do it too. And so there was sparkling wine. And like a lot of American producers, they wanted to name it after French regions or French wine. That's why you see, Chablis and Burgundy and California Burgundy and things like that. And they had California Champagne because it really helped them sell it. It sounded more luxurious. It sounded fancier. And the and so for a long time they sold them that. And then at some point, and I'll have to double check what the year was, the EU outlawed the use of the word champagne in any wine other than wine made in Champagne to protect that name, to protect the identity of it. But I think there were certain producers that were grandfathered in, or it's just that now they can't export that wine to the European Union. So it's illegal for those wines to show up in Europe or in an EU country, but they can still produce it and put the word champagne or champenoise method on the bottle. So we have another question. Is it a myth that bubbly drinks go to your head quicker? That's a good question. I think a lot of people say that. I don't think it's as related. I don't think it's related to the bubbles as much as it's related to the sugar. Like when I showed the table that had sugar levels, most dry wines, when you think about just red wine, white wine we drink that are dry wines, those are usually in the 3 grams per liter to 9 grams per liter. Right around 10 grams per liter is when most people can start perceiving sweetness or perceiving sugar. But a lot of champagne, because the acids are so high, they need sugar to balance out the acid. So that's why even Brut is more than 10 grams per liter, extra dry is more than 10 grams per liter, but sometimes it doesn't taste sweet at all. But there's still sugar there because you just can't tell because the acid's so high. So I think drinking champagne, sometimes I think the headache you get is more related to how much sugar you're drinking as opposed to the actual bubbles. And alcohol. I mean, that's because, alcohol gives me a headache even when it's dry and or sweet. So I think it's more related to that. I don't know if I'm sure someone's done a test or try to figure out if it's related to bubbles, but that's as far as I know. Yeah. Who else? Did anyone else want to tell me what they're drinking? I saw Tiffany. You were drinking some sparkling wine. What are you all enjoying?
We're having some sparkling rosé.
Ooh, from where?
It's from Ryan Patrick.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And
but I did have a question.
Yeah.
So, pardon my stemless glass. I know.
You're good.
What makes the bubble stick right here and come up?
So that's a good question. It's I can't speak on the actual scientific terms for it, but I do know that when there's an impurity or something on the glass that breaks the surface tension of the wine, that the bubbles will catch on that place. So sometimes it might just be that the glass wasn't dry. Maybe there was some residual, distillature or some whatever it could be. That bubbles will catch there and it'll release bubbles. I think I want to say nucleotide. I don't know. There's some fancy word that explains that process. But it's important. A lot of champagne flutes, if you actually look in the bottom of champagne flutes, a lot of them are etched on the bottom. There'll be a little ring scratched into the bottom of it in order to release bubbles to make it look pretty. And so it's something that you have to, if the glass was really smooth, you just wouldn't see as many bubbles, but you need those places to catch where the bubbles will continue to come up. It's the same in beer too. If you're familiar with Duvel, the Belgian beer, a Duvel glass, the branded Duvel glass has the fancy little D etched in the bottom of the glass, and that helps release a lot more fizz because it's a super carbonated beverage. So yeah, that's the reason. I'll look into the actual like fancy scientific explanation, but that's more or less what it is. So. Any questions? I just brushed. I know I brushed over Prosecco and Italian sparkling. There's some beautiful sparkling wines made all over the place, but yeah, Renee.
I will forgive you for the Prosecco
neglect. You're drinking Prosecco, yeah.
If you had to like drink one type of sparkling wine for the rest of your life, what sparkling wine of all the different types and all the different processes would you choose and why?
I mean, it'd probably be champagne, and I know that's the easiest answer. It's what most somms and most wine people would say. It's their desert island wine, but I think partly because it has the ability to age for a lot longer and change over time. If it's the only thing I could drink, Prosecco. Most Prosecco is made to be drunk young, or it's made to be consumed young, and so it's delicious, but I wouldn't want to have a bunch lying around and taste it 10 years later. It might not be great. So it'd probably be champagne, because even in champagne, you can have a wide range of styles of richer, malolactic, oak-aged champagne, or your really crisp, tart Blanc de Blanc, ones, or really fruity and floral rosé champagne. So there's still some differences that you can get a range of wines from champagne. But also I don't have enough money for it, so who knows.
When you win the lottery.
Yeah. Oh, good. I have some science friends here. I think the term you're looking for is nucleation site. Nucleation. Yep, I think that was it. I heard it in passing and couldn't remember. But yeah, that's that site where it'll release bubbles into the glass. And you tried Prosecco and California champagne. Beautiful. Nice. Yeah, those, and this, honestly, there's the quality of Prosecco and U.S. sparkling wines and Crémant. You can find some really, really great wines for not a lot of money. So even though champagne can be luxury, like even this bottle I think was only $25. I mean, it wasn't as expensive as champagne. I would not be drinking champagne if it wasn't pretty cheap champagne. So but there's so many great bottles of bubbly that I think more people should try. And it's not, again, even though it's sort of billed as this celebratory wine, you can drink it on a Thursday night. You can drink it whenever. It's the most versatile food pairing wine out there. So I always encourage people to drink more sparkling wine. So yeah. Well, if there's no more questions, I can wrap things up here. Thanks again for joining. I know that it's a lot. I was nervous because I had my notes here from like years ago where I was studying for Champagne, and these were when I was studying for exams. I try to get as much information on each page, so this helps me a little bit, but there's always more to learn. So thanks again for joining. Next week's going to be pretty fun. I'm going to be joined here by Marty Talker. So he's our managing partner at Avennia to talk. It'll be a much more Avennia-centered episode. Today we didn't really talk about Avennia at all, and that's totally okay because it's more just about wine and learning. But next week Marty will be here. We're going to taste the library wine, we're gonna talk about sort of the journey of Avennia, how we came to be, and then announce some new labels, some fun new stuff for our 10th anniversary. So with that, oh, and we had someone else drinking Trisatum wine, sparkling wine, 80% Pinot. I just love almost everything Trisatum makes, so that's a good call, Lee. Awesome, very cool. Well, thank you all again. And if you wanted to unmute yourselves to say goodbye, I always like hearing you at the end of these things. And I hope to see you next week. And we'll see you then. So thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.